My name is Commodore Vessel Warden Sethik Oranvel, and I have served the Galactic Transit Corridors Authority for 31 years. I have catalogued the wreckage of 17 wars. I have overseen the evacuation of 4 dying moons. I have watched suns flicker from the observation decks of dying stations, and felt nothing but the cold satisfaction of a professional doing her job. I say this not to impress you. I say this so you understand what it means when I tell you that what I witnessed in the Kauren Drift changed me in ways I do not yet have language for. Let me begin at the beginning. Or rather, let me begin at the smell, because that is what I remember first. The Kauren Drift smells like cold copper and burnt silence. That is not a poetic description. The drift is a region of near-dead space, 70,000 kilometers wide, where 3 ancient stellar collapse events left behind a tangled mesh of dead magnetic filaments and crystallized plasma. The filaments are invisible. They hum at frequencies that make your bones feel hollow, and they carry, lodged like insects in amber, the debris of civilizations that tried to cross them 3 centuries ago when we did not yet know better. I was stationed aboard the GCTA monitoring platform, Thesival 9, when the anomaly alert came through. I had been eating a plate of pressed seed cakes, which is a detail I include because it is the last ordinary thing I remember. The junior sensor officer, a young poly male barely 18 cycles old named Vin, came to my station with scales the color of old ash. The poly are a 4-limbed reptilian species, sleek and silver-green under normal circumstances, bioluminescent patches along their neck frills shifting in color with emotion. When Vin's frills had gone completely dark, I had learned in my years of service it meant he was afraid to speak. "Commodore," he said, "you need to see the drift readings. I need to pause here and explain something about the Kauren Drift that is relevant." 317 years ago, a colony transport class vessel called the Auranthus Seed Ship 7 departed the Poly homeworld carrying, among its passengers, what historical records described as an educational cohort. 412 young students, ages 6 to 14 polycycles, accompanied by their teachers, heading to a new settlement colony in the Outer Rim. The Auranthus 7, for reasons that were never fully understood because the ship was never recovered, entered the drift and did not emerge. The poly mourned it as a civilization mourns a wound that never fully closes. They named a public square after it. They held an annual memorial. They classified the vessel as lost with all hands. 317 years passed, and then Vin showed me his readings. The Auranthus 7 was still in the drift. Not just wreckage, not a debris field. The ship's emergency biosuspension pods, designed for exactly this kind of worst-case scenario, had activated within hours of the ship entering the drift and becoming entangled in the magnetic filaments. The pods had kept functioning for 3 centuries on emergency geothermal cells, the kind that were overbuilt to last exactly this long and not a day longer. The pod's power reserves, according to our deep scan readings, had approximately 91 standard hours remaining. 412 poly children, suspended in biological stasis for 317 years, still alive, were now dying on a countdown I could read in real time on my display screen. "How is that possible?" I said, and I did not mean it as a question. I meant it as a statement of the universe behaving in a way it had no right to. I immediately understood the problem. The drift's magnetic filaments made conventional navigation impossible. Any ship that entered would be seized by the filaments within minutes. We had lost probe after probe trying to map the interior of the drift. Emergency vessels could not approach within 30,000 kilometers without their navigation systems failing. We had developed a protocol over the decades for exactly this kind of scenario. And the protocol said, plainly, there is no protocol. The drift was impassable. 91 hours. I called the GCTA Emergency Council. I called the Poly-Governmental Authority. I called our senior engineering teams. I called everyone I had ever called in 31 years of doing this job. What followed defied explanation. Not because anyone was incompetent, but because the problem was simply, mathematically, absolutely unsolvable with the tools we possessed. Every navigation AI we ran through the drift's filament map came back with the same answer. Probability of successful transit, 0.000%. The filaments were too dense, too dynamic, too unpredictably magnetic. Any ship with electronic navigation would seize up within minutes of entry. What about manual navigation? Asked one of my engineers. A Durack woman named Counselor Pesh, who I will describe for you because the Durack are relevant to this story. The Durack are large, warm-blooded, densely furred beings, 8-limbed, their fur typically deep auburn or charcoal. They are the oldest spacefaring civilization in the known corridors, and they hold a significant portion of seats on the GCTA Council. They are culturally extremely risk-averse. They have an expression in their language that translates roughly as, "The known road walked slowly is wiser than the unknown road run fast." It is on their council chamber wall. Manual navigation requires a pilot who can fly without any functioning navigation assistance, using only visual and tactile feedback from the ship itself. Through 70,000 kilometers of dynamic magnetic filament that moves, I told her. No civilization has produced a pilot capable of that kind of flying. The Drift has eaten every probe we have ever sent. What about the Valak competition pilots, someone suggested. Their craft use magnetic repulsion systems. The filaments would invert their controls and crash. Then within 2 kilometers, silence. Settled over the emergency channel like a physical. Wait, Vin's frills had gone so dark I could barely see his. Bioluminescent patches at all. 89. Hours, I do not know exactly who made the first suggestion. It may have been one of the younger staff members on the council. It may have been one of the poly observers who had joined the channel when news broke of the Aranthis 7 discovery. What I know is that at a certain point someone said quietly, the thing that no one had said yet. What? About a human pilot. The reaction in the room was what you might expect from a gathering of very experienced professionals who had spent their careers navigating situations with rational tools. Several people said nothing. Counselor Pesh made a sound specific to the Durack that indicates polite dismissal. One of the poly observers, a senior government official named Minister Tel Oris, whose frills had been deep amber with grief since the moment the Aranthis 7 was confirmed, said clearly and without warmth, "This is not a moment for jokes." I understood his reaction. Let me explain the galactic consensus on human pilots as it stood at that time. Humans had been spacefaring for approximately 240 years. In galactic terms, this made them recent arrivals, barely past their atmospheric phase. They were short-lived, fragile, biologically unremarkable, and had a habit of approaching space travel with an attitude that the older civilizations found somewhere between amusing and alarming. They were not known for precision. They were not known for discipline. They were known primarily for doing things that should not work and being extremely casual about it. The human pilot community in particular had a reputation that could most charitably be described as eccentric. They raced modified atmospheric craft through asteroid fields for entertainment. They ran courier routes through regions that GCTA navigation charts flagged as inadvisable. They modified their own ship systems in ways that voided warranties and frequently also voided physics. The formal assessment of human pilots in the GCTA Transit Performance Index, which I had contributed to writing, described them as, and I am quoting from the official document here, unpredictable, unreliable under sustained stress, prone to improvisation over protocol, and unsuitable for high-precision navigation tasks. We had written that assessment 7 years ago. I had signed my name to it. 86 hours. It was Vin who pulled the database file. He was young enough to not yet have the professional instinct that tells you not to try things that cannot possibly work, and I am grateful for that. There is a human registered in the Kauren Drift transit corridor, he said. Cargo hauler. Independent contractor. She has the only vessel currently logged within response range of the Drift. He turned his display toward me. The vessel was registered under the GCTA independent contractor system as the Mira's Margin. Class light hauler, heavy modified. The modifications list was 3 pages long and had notes from 3 different GCTA inspection officers, all variations of technically compliant but deeply concerning. The pilot's name was listed as Emma Voss, occupation, independent cargo hauler, licensed for outer corridor routes. Age 34 standard years, which in human terms is, as I understand it, neither very young nor very old. Previous violations, 17. Mostly to do with filing flight paths that did not match her actual flight paths, which is a thing humans do with a frequency that we have never fully understood. The file had a note from a GCTA inspector that read, verbatim, pilot has encyclopedic knowledge of non-standard navigation and is not afraid to use it. Use of the word afraid was, I later understood, the inspector trying to tell us something. There was one line near the bottom of the file under additional background that I almost did not read because I was already reaching for the communication channel. I am glad I read it. It said, prior to commercial licensing, pilot participated in Belter racing circuit, Outer Carith asteroid belt for 11 years. Specialty, zero navigation runs. I did not know what zero navigation runs were. I asked Vin. Vin looked it up. His frills shifted briefly to a startled pale gold. It is, he said carefully, a form of racing in asteroid belts in which pilots remove or disable all navigation assistance systems and fly purely on manual judgment and physical feedback from the vessel. It is considered extremely dangerous by galactic standards and is technically illegal in 6 systems. I stared at the file for what was probably 4 seconds and felt like 4 hours. Then I opened the communication channel. She answered on the second ping. I had expected, given what I knew of human communication patterns, some kind of delay. I had expected perhaps to leave a message. What I had not expected was the immediate, slightly distracted voice of a woman who sounded like she was doing something else at the same time. This is the Mira's margin, Voss speaking. If you are GCTA, my cargo manifest is filed and correct, the modifications are all certified, and whatever inspection officer Dunval told you, I would like to formally dispute. I identified myself. I gave her my rank and station designation. I told her the situation in as few words as I could, because the situation was the kind that did not improve from elaboration. There was a pause. A short one. 400 kids, she said. 412, including their teachers. In the drift. Yes. 90 hours. 84, now. Another pause. I could hear in the background of her audio feed the particular low hum of a ship's engine running at cruise speed. I could hear her tapping something on a hard surface. I found out later she was tapping her thumbnail against her own front teeth, which is apparently something she did when thinking. I found that out later in the debrief. At the time, I simply waited. Here's the thing, she said, and her voice had shifted slightly, not to seriousness exactly, to something else. Something I would not have the right word for until after all of this was over. My nav system is going to cut out the moment I hit the filament boundary. You know that, right? Your scans will lose me. I will be completely dark for the transit. I am aware of that. No external guidance. No signal in, no signal out. Not until I'm through the other side or into the ship itself if she's got any shielding left. I am aware of that as well. So if I go in there and I hit something, or I get snagged, or I make a wrong call on a filament cluster, you will have no way of knowing until I don't come out. That is correct. Okay, said Emma Voss. I waited for the rest of the sentence. There was no rest of the sentence. That is, I said carefully, your complete response? Well, I mean, I also need about 20 minutes to reconfigure my sensor array for tactile feedback, mode and pull my old racing harness out of the storage compartment because I haven't used it in 3 years and I think it's under a crate of Durek mineral samples, but yeah, that's the answer part. Vin's frills went very briefly, bright gold. The next 6 hours were agony. I want to be precise about that word. I have used it loosely in my career. I do not use it loosely now. I tracked her approach on long-range sensors until she hit the drift boundary. I watched her vessel's signature vanish from our displays like a candle being cupped by a hand. And then there was nothing. No signal, no position data, no life sign telemetry, just the drift, humming in frequencies that made the monitoring platform's hull resonate at the edges of audibility. Like something enormous breathing, Counselor Pesh had come to stand beside me. She did not say anything. This was unusual for Pesh. She had opinions about most things, delivered consistently and thoroughly. The silence told me more than any words would have. Minister Tail Oris was in the secondary observation lounge with the other poly observers. I could see them through the window, clustered together, their frills cycling through colors I did not have cultural training to fully interpret. I knew enough to recognize that some of what I was seeing was the particular amber gold of old grief being reopened. Vin stayed at his sensor station. He did not leave it for 6 hours. I realized something in that silence that kept me awake for weeks afterward. I realized that in all of my years of professional assessment, in all the formal documents and transit performance indices I had written and signed and stamped with official authority, I had never once considered what it would feel like to have the entire database of galactic knowledge be completely useless, to have nothing to offer except the unverifiable judgment of one human woman flying dark through 70,000 kilometers of magnetic filaments that had eaten every probe we had ever sent. I had no models for this. No protocol. No precedent. All I had was the hum of the drift and the sound of 412 life support systems counting down on a display I could not stop. Watching, 78 hours remaining. Hour 6 and 40 minutes. Finn's console chimed. It was the faintest possible signal. Not from our scanning systems, from the Oranthus 7 itself. A passive beacon, old technology, broadcasting on a frequency so ancient that Vin had to pull a historical codec library to decode it. It was an internal ship communication. Audio only, not directed at us. Not intended for external broadcast, Emma Voss had reached the Oranthus 7. We listened. The first thing we heard was the hiss of an atmospheric seal being breached. Then footsteps quick and purposeful on a hard surface. Then, in the background, a low rhythmic sound that took me a moment to identify. The emergency suspension pods. Still cycling. Still running. Okay, said Emma Voss's voice. Slightly breathless, and I could hear the grin in it even through static. You are a lot better maintained than you have any right to be. Old girl. She was talking to the ship. The next thing we heard was a panel being opened. Then several sounds I could not immediately identify, which I later understood were tools being deployed with great speed and efficiency. Then a long stretch of near silence in which the only sounds were her breathing, occasional muttered comments in a human language I did not know, and the steady cycling of the suspension systems. Then something changed in the audio. A tone, a warning system activating. Yeah, I see you, she said calmly. Voss sees you. 18 pods flagged for cell degradation. Got it, more sounds of tools. A sharp clang. A hiss, okay, she said, to no one or to the ship or perhaps simply to the universe. Here is the deal. I have 4.5 hours before I need to start the return transit, because I need daylight on my nav recalibration, and I am not doing a second run on guesswork. So we are going to fix you. And then I am going to wake the teachers first, because someone needs to explain to 400 kids that they have been asleep since before their grandparents were born, and I am not qualified for that conversation. Vin made a sound. I looked at him. His frills were full gold, the poly expression for something that has no direct translation but sits somewhere, between wonder and the kind of feeling you get when something you thought was impossible turns out to simply have been waiting. Counselor? Pesh had her hand on my arm. I noticed this distantly. She was gripping quite firmly. She did not appear to notice she was doing it. We listened to Emma Voss work. This is where I must be careful, because what followed defied explanation in ways that I have spent months trying to document accurately. The Oranthus 7's biosuspension system was 317-year-old technology. It was not compatible with any current repair tools. The components that required replacement were not components that existed in any current parts catalog. The ship's power routing had degraded in ways that the original designers would not have anticipated, because they had not designed the ship to be in service for 3 centuries. Emma Voss fixed it in 4 hours and 11 minutes. She did not have the right tools. She fabricated adapters from components in her own ship's repair kit. She did not have schematics for the Oranthus 7 systems. She pulled the ship's engineering logs from the 3-century-old memory banks and read them on a handheld, in real time while working with the other hand. She stabilized all 18 failing pods. She rerouted the ship's backup power to extend the suspension system's operation window by 60 additional hours, and then, with 23 minutes remaining on her transit window, she woke the teachers. We did not hear all of that conversation. The passive beacon had intermittent gaps. What we heard was enough. A sound of atmospheric awakening. Coughing. The disorientation that comes from 3 centuries of biological suspension, which I understand is profound and deeply unpleasant. Voices in the old Pali dialect, which the modern Pali observers on our platform could understand and were translating in hushed voices behind me. Confusion. Fear, the word for children, repeated. And then Emma Voss's voice, slow and clear, speaking in what I was told later was a basic poly-trade dialect she had learned. Imperfectly, over years of outer corridor runs. The children are safe. All of them. I checked every pod. Your ship is stable. I have bought you 60 hours. There are people waiting to bring you home. A silence. Then, in the old dialect, one of the teachers, asking how long, Emma Voss did not hesitate. A while, she said. You should sit down first. I walked to the secondary observation lounge. I do not entirely remember making the decision to do so. I stood at the window and watched Minister Tayloris as the translation came through his earpiece. I have seen, in 31 years, things that moved me. I do not use that phrase loosely either. I am not by nature or by professional conditioning easily moved. The minister was old. His frills had been silver gray for the years I had known him, which in the Pali indicated age without shame, the way stone weathers to something more dignified than what it started as. When the translation reached him, those frills did something I had never seen before. They went white. Not the white of fear, which the Pali indicate with blue-white at the tips. Just white, the color with no cultural assignment, the color of something that has gone past the vocabulary the body has for feeling. He put his hands against the observation window, four-fingered hands slightly trembling, and quietly, to no one, he said the old Pali word that means found. Not recovered, not rescued. The specific word that is only used for things you had stopped believing could be found. The word that acknowledges both the loss and the ending of it at the same time. I turned back to my station. I had a rescue convoy to coordinate. There was a great deal of work to do, but I stood there for an extra moment, and I thought about 412 children asleep for 317 years, and one human woman with a racing harness and a repair kit and imperfect Pali, and the word for found. I moved to the long-range array station myself. I did not ask Vin to move. He understood, and stepped aside without a word. The convoy was already being assembled. 3 GCTA heavy rescue vessels, 2 Pali government transports, and a medical frigate from the nearest station. They were positioned at the drift boundary, engines running, waiting for the Oranthus 7 to be guided out from the inside by the tow line Emma Voss had, apparently already begun attaching to the old ship's hull connectors. The plan, as she had communicated it in a brief burst transmission before going dark again, was simple. She would complete the tow line attachment. She would pilot the Mira's margin out of the drift first, pulling the Oranthus 7 behind her on a passive mechanical line, which would not be affected by the magnetic filaments the way electronic tethers would be. The rescue convoy would then take over at the drift boundary and bring the school ship the rest of the way in. The plan was simple, the execution was not. What followed defied explanation. And I mean that in the technical sense. I have written 4 separate official reports about what our external sensors recorded during those hours, and every one of them has come back from the review board with a query attached, asking me to verify the data, because the data does not match what our models say is possible. Let me tell you what we saw from the outside. The drift, as I have said, is 70,000 kilometers wide. The magnetic filaments within it are not static. They move. They shift with the residual magnetic tides from the 3 ancient stellar collapse events that created the drift in the first place. A filament cluster that was in one position when Emma Voss entered was not in the same position when she needed to exit. This is why we had never retrieved anything from the drift. This is why every probe we sent was eventually caught. The filaments were a moving puzzle, and the puzzle changed while you were solving it. Emma Voss was pulling a 317-year-old colony ship on a mechanical tow, and the Oranthus 7 massed approximately 40 times what the Mira's margin massed. She was flying without navigation, without instruments, without any external guidance whatsoever, because our signals could not penetrate the drift, and she was not asking for them anyway. The next 4 hours and 30 minutes were agony of a different kind than the first 6. Because this time we could see something on our long-range passive resonance array, not clearly, not with precision. The filaments scattered. The resonance returns into something that looked less like a sensor reading and more like a fever dream, but we could see movement. Something was moving through the drift. something that was not being captured by the filaments, something that was finding the gaps between the magnetic currents with a consistency that our analysis software, running in real time, categorized repeatedly as statistically improbable. Vin had pulled a chair up beside me. He was watching the resonance display with the focused intensity of someone watching a very thin wire hold a very great weight. "How is she doing that?" he said. It was not a question he expected me to answer. He knew I did not have the answer. He was asking it the way you ask things when the asking is the only honest response to what you are seeing. I did not answer him. Short sentences now, because this is where things moved fast. The resonance return shifted. A filament cluster was moving into the projected path. I saw it on the display. I could do nothing. The cluster was enormous, old. One of the anchor filaments from the original stellar collapse, which our charts showed as effectively permanent. It sat in the drift like a wall that Emma Voss could not see on any instrument because she had no instruments. Vin's frills went dark. Counselor Pesh gripped my arm again, and this time she knew she was doing it. I watched the resonance return of two ships, one large and one small, moving toward a magnetic wall that would catch them both and hold them until their power died. The small ship stopped, not slowed, stopped, dead in space, inside the drift with a 40 times heavier vessel on a mechanical line behind it. For 11 seconds, nothing moved. Then the small ship turned, not the direction I expected, not back, not parallel to the filament wall to search for a gap. It turned perpendicular, 90 degrees off its previous heading, and it accelerated hard. Our resonance return showed the tow line going taut, showed the Aranthus 7, massive and slow, beginning to swing, wide, in an arc, like a weight on a rope. "What?" said Counselor Pesh. Her voice was completely flat. I understood what Emma Voss was doing approximately 4 seconds before she did it, and those 4 seconds were the longest 4 seconds of my career. She was using the Aranthus 7's mass as a pendulum. She swung it, in a controlled arc, using the mirror's margin as the pivot point. The old school ship came around in a slow, enormous curve, its mass building momentum, and then Emma Voss released the tow brake, and the Aranthus 7 swung wide and cleared the filament cluster with, according to our post-transit analysis, approximately 40 meters of clearance on the nearest filament. 40 meters. In 70,000 kilometers of magnetic maze, Vin fainted. I want to be precise about this. He did not lean back and feel faint. He was sitting in a chair and he simply went sideways and was on the floor, his frills cycling from dark to gold to dark again in the automated stress response of an unconscious Polly. Nobody moved to help him for approximately 6 seconds because everyone in the monitoring station was staring at the same display. Then, one of the junior technicians picked him up and propped him in the chair, and I think she was crying, which among humans indicates overwhelming emotion, and she had not taken her eyes off the display while she did it. The two ships cleared the drift boundary 41 minutes later. The Mira's margin emerged first. Then the Aranthus 7, still on the mechanical tow line, vast and dark and ancient, trailing 3 centuries of accumulated cosmic dust. Like a shroud, it was finally allowed to take off. The rescue convoy's communications array lit up with transmissions simultaneously from approximately 60 sources. I did not hear most of them. I was watching the Mira's margin on visual. It was a battered thing. Light hauler class, which means it was never intended to be beautiful, and the 11 years of outer corridor cargo runs and whatever Emma Voss had done to it in the course of modifications had not improved its aesthetics. One of the cargo bay panels was a slightly different shade of gray than the others, clearly a replacement. The engine housing had been repaired with what looked at visual magnification like non-standard alloy plates. It looked like a ship that had been kept going through stubbornness alone. I found it, for reasons I still cannot fully articulate, one of the most impressive things I had ever seen. The medical teams boarded the Aranthus 7 within minutes of the convoy taking over the tow. The Poly government had dispatched specialists in ancient dialect, in 3-century displacement trauma, in the specific medical protocols required for long-term suspension revival. The teachers had been awake for several hours. They had been briefed by Emma Voss in imperfect but apparently sufficient trade Poly. They had been given time to collect themselves, which is, I have been told, necessary before you begin explaining to someone that their entire civilization has continued without them for 300 years. The children were woken over a period of 12 hours, in small groups with teachers present for every waking. I did not witness this directly. I received reports. I want to tell you about one of those reports. The youngest child on the Aranthis 7 was 6 cycles old. Her name was Sail. She had boarded the ship for what her parents had told her would be a great adventure, a journey to a new colony world, a new beginning. She had been suspended within an hour of the ship entering the drift, before she had time to understand that something had gone wrong. As far as her biological experience was concerned, she had gone to sleep in her pod and woken up 6 cycles old, the same as she had always been. Emma Voss was still aboard the Aranthis 7 when Sael was woken. She had not yet returned to the Mira's margin. She had stayed to help with the revival process because, she said, in a communication logged with the medical team, she was decent at talking to scared people and they seemed short on hands. The medical team's report noted, in dry clinical language, that the human contractor was present during the revival of the youngest passenger and provided informal comfort support during initial disorientation. What the clinical language does not carry is what the medical team's junior officer, a young poly woman, described to me afterward in her personal debrief. She had been in the room. She had seen it. Sail had woken frightened. This was expected. The disorientation of revival is significant, and she was 6 cycles old and the room was full of strangers. She had cried for her mother in the old dialect, in a word so ancient that the junior medical officer had needed a second to parse it. Emma Voss had been on the other side of the room checking a suspension panel. She had heard the child and she had crossed the room without hesitating, and she had sat down on the floor beside the pod so that she was at eye level with a 6-year-old poly child. Sail had looked at her. This strange being with 2 eyes and no frills and the wrong number of fingers and fur only on the top of her head. Emma Voss had said something. In trade, Polly. Slowly. The junior officer said her dialect was imperfect but clear. She had said, "You were very brave to sleep so long." Sail had looked at her for a long moment. Then she had reached out and touched Emma Voss's hand with 2 fingers, the poly greeting gesture used between those who do not yet know each other's names. Emma Voss had touched back. 2 fingers. She had clearly learned this somewhere. The junior officer said she did it with the exact correct pressure, which is not something most non-poly get right. Then Sail had asked where her mother was, and Emma Voss, who had just flown 70,000 kilometers of magnetic filaments blind, who had repaired a 3-century-old suspension system with improvised tools, who had swung a 40 times heavier ship on a mechanical tow line through a gap measured in meters, sat on the floor of the Aranthis 7 and said, quietly, that her mother was going to be so proud of her, and that there were people coming who would explain everything, and that she was not alone. She stayed on the floor with Sael until the poly family trauma counselor arrived. The junior medical officer, in her debrief, said that she had needed to step out of the room for a moment after that. She said she was sorry if that had been unprofessional. I told her it was not unprofessional. I said this from some authority, because I had needed to do the same thing when I read the report. Emma Voss returned to the Mira's margin 6 hours after the convoy had the Aranthis 7 secured. I contacted her for the formal debrief. It is required by GCTA protocol. I will not pretend I did not also want to speak to her. She answered on the second ping exactly as she had before with the same slightly distracted energy. I could hear the Mira's margin's engines running. She was, I noted, with no surprise whatsoever, already moving. Already going somewhere, Commodore Orenvel, she said. I've got the debrief forms, I'm filling them out. My incident report is going to be a little unusual, but everything I did was within my contractor license. The debrief can wait, I said. A brief pause. You okay? This struck me as a very human question to ask a senior GCTA officer with 31 years of experience. I'm conducting your debrief, Ms. Voss, I said. How are you? Tired, she said. I could use about 14 hours of sleep and a meal that didn't come out of an emergency ration pack. But good. Yeah, good. The poly government has formally requested that you attend a recognition ceremony, I told her. The request was filed approximately 1 hour ago. Minister Tel Oris submitted it personally. Oh, she said, a pause. She said. I mean, they don't have to do that. There are 412 children who would not be alive if you had not entered the drift, I said. Minister Tail Oris seems to feel that doing that is, in fact, the minimum appropriate response. Another pause. Longer. I heard her tapping her thumbnail against her teeth. Is Sail okay? She asked. It was not the question I had expected. The child. Is she okay? She's being cared for by the trauma counseling team, I said. She is expected to integrate well. She is 6. They say the young ones often do. Relative to the older passengers. Good, said Emma Voss. And I heard something in her voice that she was clearly not going to say out loud, so I did not ask her to. Because I am 31 years a professional and I know when something is being held privately and when it ought to be. The ceremony, I said. Yeah, okay, she said. Send me the coordinates. But I want it on the record that this is embarrassing and those kids are the brave ones, not me. Noted, I said. It will be on the record. Also the teachers. The teachers kept those systems running for 300 years on original engineering. Someone should acknowledge that. Also noted. Okay. I heard her settle back in her pilot seat. I'll be there. Give me 40 hours to sleep and eat and I'll be there. Ms. Voss, I said. Yeah. I found, in that moment, that the official language I had available to me was entirely insufficient. I had the language of commendation and the language of formal recognition and the language of professional debrief. None of it was the right language for what I wanted to say. What you did in the drift, I said. The transit? The pendulum maneuver? Oh, the swing, she said, and I could hear her shrug in her voice. Yeah, we used to call that a gravity hammer in the Belter circuit. You use it when a straight line is blocked and you need to move something bigger than your ship. Usually a competitor's vessel that's being difficult. Not usually a colony ship. That was a first. I realized something in that moment that kept me awake for weeks afterward. She was not being falsely modest. She was not deflecting because she did not understand the magnitude of what she had done. She was deflecting because in her frame of reference, she had used an available tool to solve an available problem. The fact that no other pilot in the known galaxy had the specific set of experiences that would make that tool available, to her was not something she was inclined to dwell on. She had done what she knew how to do. The fact that what she knew how to do had been impossible 10 hours ago was apparently the galaxy's problem to reconcile, not hers. The recognition ceremony was held 3 weeks later on the Poly homeworld. I attended. Counselor Pesh attended. Vin attended, having recovered from his fainting with the specific embarrassment of a young professional hoping no one will mention it, which everyone mentioned constantly. The Oranthus 7's passengers were in various stages of reintegration. It was a complex process. 317 years is not a gap that closes quickly, either emotionally or culturally. The Poly government had assembled an entire ministry to manage the transition. There were, as you might expect, enormous political and societal implications that will take generations to fully resolve. But on that day, in that square, they came. All 412 of them. The teachers, silver-haired now in their revival, many of them still adjusting to a world 3 centuries past what they had known. The children, some of them still unsteady, some of them looking around at a world they were being told was theirs with the wide, careful eyes of the very young encountering the very new. Sail was in the front row. I recognized her from the medical file photograph. She was 6 cycles old, which she had been for 3 centuries, which she would possibly be processing in various ways for the rest of her life. Emma Voss stood on the platform in what I later learned was the cleanest set of clothes she owned, which was still a flight jacket and cargo trousers, because she was a cargo hauler and this was what she had. Minister Tel Oris presented her with the Poly Covenant Star, which is the highest civilian recognition the Poly government can bestow, and which had not been presented to a non-Poly individual in the 400 years since the award existed. First of her kind, in the history of the award. Emma Voss accepted it with both hands, the Poly formal gesture of receiving with gratitude. She had clearly practiced this. She did it correctly. Several people in the crowd made the sound that is the Poly equivalent of being unable to speak. She said, and I am giving you her exact words because they matter. I want to be clear that I did the easy part. I just flew a ship. The hard part was 400 people keeping each other alive for 300 years on equipment that was never supposed to last that long, and then waking up in a world they'd never seen and being brave about it. If you're giving out stars, you should be giving them to every person on that ship. She paused. Also to my ship, she said. The Mira's Margin is 32 years old and she never complained once. Several people laughed. Several others were still making the sound of being unable to speak. These were not mutually exclusive groups. Sale came forward at the end of the ceremony. I do not know who arranged this. I suspect it was not officially arranged. I suspect she simply walked to the front, the way 6-year-olds sometimes do when they have decided something, and the crowd parted because you do not stop a 6-year-old who has decided. She stood in front of Emma Voss and held out 2 fingers. Emma Voss crouched down. 2 fingers back. Correct pressure. Sale said something in the new dialect, which she had been learning with the focused intensity of a child who has decided that the future is a place she intends to live in. The translation was given to me afterward by one of the ceremony staff. She had said, I am going to learn to fly. Emma Voss had looked at her for a long moment. Then she had said in trade Pali with her imperfect accent and her absolutely correct intent, then you will need to learn how to make a map out of what you feel instead of what you see. Sale had considered this with the seriousness of someone 6 years, old and 317 years, wise. Then she had nodded once, the way children nod when they have filed something important away for later. Within hours of the ceremony, the broadcast had reached every major system in the transit corridors. By the next day, the GCTA inbox had received formal inquiries from 14 governments regarding the status of the Mira's Margin's contractor license, its route authorizations, and whether Emma Voss was available for consultation on a variety of navigational problems they had previously classified as unsolvable. Within the week, the Belter racing circuit, which had been technically illegal in 6 systems, had been quietly reclassified by 3 of those systems as an unauthorized training program of potential strategic value. Someone, I later found out it was Vin, had compiled a formal proposal arguing that the GCTA Transit Performance Index assessment of human pilots should be revised. He submitted it through official channels with 17 pages of supporting data and one attached note that said simply, I was there. The proposal was approved. I signed the revised assessment myself. Several months have passed since the drift. The Aranthis 7 is now a museum ship. It sits in orbit above the Pali homeworld, fully restored, its suspension pods preserved as they were. You can tour it. People do, in enormous numbers. The Pali made it a heritage site within a month of recovery, which is the fastest heritage designation in their government's history. Sael is still 6 cycles old, which will continue to be true for many years. She is in a specialized educational program designed for the Aranthis 7 children. She is, by all accounts, very good at mathematics and has a particular interest in spatial navigation. Minister Tyle Oris retired from his position 3 months after the ceremony. He had said in his retirement address that there are moments that complete something you did not know was unfinished, and that following such a moment with ordinary work felt like a category error. He now serves as a voluntary advisor to the Aranthis 7 Integration Ministry. He visits the museum ship regularly. He does not explain why to anyone who asks, and no one who knows him presses him on it. Emma Voss filed her incident report. It was 17 pages long and technically compliant and contained a note at the end that said the Mira's Margin's engine coupling had developed a slight hesitation during the second transit and she was logging it for maintenance purposes. She is currently, as of my last information, running a cargo route through the Outer Kareth Belt. She has not taken any of the 14 government consultation contracts. She sent a brief communication to the GCTA office regarding one of them that said, and I am quoting, I appreciate it, but I'm a hauler, not a consultant. If you need something carried somewhere complicated, that I can do, let me know. She has not changed her filed flight paths to match her actual flight paths. I have noted this in her file with no further action. I find I do not have it in me. I returned to Thessival 9 2 months ago. Back to the monitoring platform. Back to the pressed seed cakes and the long-range sensor arrays and the quiet of a job that is mostly watching and waiting. I sit, sometimes, At the station where I watched the drift swallow the mirror's margin and go silent, I think about what I know of human history. 240 years of spacefaring, a species that is, by every formal metric we have developed, unremarkable. Short lives, fragile bodies, no innate navigational sense, no bioluminescence, no extended memory, no natural adaptation to space. They should not be particularly good at any of this. And yet I think about 11 years in asteroid belts, racing without instruments, learning to read space through the feeling in your hands and the sound of your own engines. I think about a skill built for an illegal race, circuit that turned out to be the only tool, capable of reaching 412 children that every other civilization had spent 3 centuries accepting as lost. I think about what else they have. All of them. Every one of those short-lived, fragile, casually dangerous beings carrying around skills we have never thought to ask about, born from lives we have never thought to document, ready to deploy them in situations we have never thought to classify as solvable. I think about the Transit Performance Index I signed 7 years ago. Unpredictable, prone to improvisation, unsuitable for high-precision tasks. I think about how we meant those as criticisms. Finn asked me, recently, whether I thought we would encounter more situations like the drift, more impossible problems that turned out to have a human-shaped solution waiting in a contractor registry somewhere. I told him I thought it was very likely. He asked me if I thought that was a good thing. I told him I thought it was what it was, and that our job was to be honest about what we saw and document it accurately, and update our assessments when the evidence required it. He thought about this for a moment. Then he said, "But do you think it's good? For us? For the galaxy?" I looked out at the Kauren Drift, still there, still humming. Still copper and silence in the particular darkness of space that has eaten everything we ever sent into it. Except for one battered light hauler with a 32-year-old frame and a pilot who grew up flying blind. I thought about what it means to invite a species into your corridors, to give them licenses and transit rights and contractor registrations, to file them under categories you invented before you understood what they were, to measure them with instruments built for measuring things you already knew. Thought about the word the Pali use for what cannot be found and then is. I thought about Sale's 2 fingers and Emma, Voss's 2 fingers back, and the particular patience of someone teaching a child to navigate by feeling. I thought about what else is out there, in other belts, in other illegal circuits, in other lives we have never thought to ask about. I think, I said to Vin carefully, that we should be grateful. I paused. And I think we should be paying very close attention. He accepted this. He is a good officer. He knows when a superior is giving him the answer they have and not the answer they are still working toward. The truth is, I am still working toward it. The truth is, I am not certain grateful is the right word. I'm not certain any word I have is the right word. The categories I have for thinking about other species were built by people who had never met humans, and the categories keep failing, and I keep updating them, and they keep failing again. We had spent 2 centuries classifying them, assessing them, filing them into the indices we built for things we understood. We had welcomed wolves and called them sheep, and the wolves had saved our children and tucked them in gently, and learned the right pressure for a 2-fingered greeting, and gone back to their cargo routes without asking for anything. And somewhere in the outer Kareth belt, one of them was flying dark right now, reading space through her hands, going somewhere complicated. I wonder sometimes where. The end.